Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how easy it is to create your very own custom form validation using JavaScript, alright? So this solution right here is not going to require any sort of external libraries or frameworks. It's all going to be done using vanilla JavaScript and JavaScript classes, alright? So this right here is going to be the finished product. As we can see, we have this validation on this username field right here, as well as the preferred language dropdown. So I'll get to the dropdown later on, but we can see here that it says username cannot contain numbers. So if I was to remove the numbers from this username and get out of it, we can see the validation is going to go away. Now, as long as there is at least one error message on this form, we are unable to submit the form, as we can see right down here. But as soon as I, of course, make it okay, I can now submit the form. All right, so that's working perfectly fine. Now, we can see here that this username cannot contain numbers. This is of course pretty basic validation, but we're actually able to provide our very own custom validation, which can basically be whatever you guys want, which means you can easily include this on an existing website or project, and you should be satisfied with the results. Okay, so as an example right here, we can see if I was to choose something like Kotlin for my preferred language, it's going to say here, sorry, you can only like JavaScript. So this right here, like I mentioned, it's totally custom, and I'm going to be showing you guys how to do this as well. All right, now all of the source code is going to be linked down below if you want to download and follow along while you watch today's video. So now let's go inside this tab right here and begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. Now, we are keeping the same HTML and CSS because those aren't really important for today's video, but if you do want to download the HTML and CSS, you are very welcome to do so. So, going inside VS Code right here, this is what the HTML currently looks like. So nothing too fancy going on. I've only got in a linked CSS style sheet as well as this form right here with an ID of sign up. So this of course is our main form which we're going to be applying the validation to. Then down here we have this structure for the input fields. So I've got a main div with a class of input, and this here is going to be the container for my label, my input field itself, and finally the error message if there was any. So we can see here that this div is always going to exist no matter if you have an error or not. All right, so basically when there's no text inside the div, then it's going to have a 0 height anyway, so you won't be able to see it. Okay, so you guys don't need to have the same structure as this right here, but it will definitely help if you do follow something similar. As long as you have a div for a error, then you're totally fine. And as we can see here, the same thing is going on for the drop down, but of course it's now a select menu as opposed to an input field from right up here. So when it comes to the CSS, we can see, of course, once again, not much going on, nothing too important. Just a dark background, of course, width on the sign up form, etc. Like I said, nothing too fancy, but the input __ error class for the error messages, these of course are going to have a smaller font size and a color of red. So once again, you guys can also do something like this. So getting to the main content for today's video, of course, the JavaScript, we're going to begin by creating a new directory right up here called JS. Okay, so inside this JavaScript directory, we can now create two files. One of them is going to be the main file for the website. So you guys may already have a main JavaScript file. If you do, you should be able to reuse it as long as you include a type of module in the link tag or in the script tag. So I'll get to that later on, but for now, we can create a new file here called main.js and a second file here called form validator. Okay, so this right here, this file is going to be the main code for the form validator, and it's actually going to be a JavaScript class. So we're going to head inside the index.html and just include the main.js file. Okay, so Up inside the head here, we're going to say script source going to js/main.js. Then, very important, we include a type of module here. This is going to do two things. It's firstly going to allow us to use the import export syntax. So we can, of course, import the form validator into our main file. And also it's going to make sure that the script is going to be deferred, which means only once the document has finished parsing, then it is going to execute. It's going to save you any issues you might have with things being undefined and things like that. All right. So going back inside the form validator class here or file, we can now export a JavaScript class. So we're going to say here, export default class, and call this class form validator. So if you're not too comfortable with JavaScript classes, I've got a whole video series dedicated to that if you're interested in watching that before this one. But if not, it should be fine. But essentially, this class is going to be instantiated inside this main.js to create a new form validator. And you're going to want to create a new form validator for every single form that you have. Okay, so this right here is going to support multiple input fields of the same form. In most cases, one instance is probably fine if you got one form, but anyway, export default is going to allow us to, of course, import this class from this file right here. But going inside the form validator body here, we can define a constructor. So the constructor for this class is going to take in the form element itself, which is going to be validated. So right here, we can just say something like selector. So when I mentioned that it's going to be passed in, you can, of course, pass it in, but we're actually going to provide it with a CSS selector here. That way we can now say something like this.form is equal to document.query selector, then pass in through the selector. So now, of course, you can create a new instance of form validator and simply pass through the ID of your form. So let's do that right now. We're going back inside the main.js and we're going to say right up here, import form validator from /form validator.js. Make sure you have .js at the end of this right here. Now we can simply say const fv, short for form validator, equal to a new instance of form validator. Then we're going to pass through here the selector. The selector, of course, is simply going to be hash sign up in my case, because of course I have an ID of sign up on my form right inside here. So a simple CSS selector being passed through there. I'm now going to say here, window.fv is equal to fv. The reason for this is so we can actually inspect the contents of this fv object. So going back inside the browser right here, I can now refresh the page and we can see if I just do window.fv in my console, we can see we have that instance of form validator right there, and we have the form element object in the class or in the object. All right. Cool. So going back inside here, I now just want to simply define two new things on this class, and then we're actually going to start by taking a look at the usage of this validator and how to then set your rules. So we can say here, get has errors, okay? And we can simply say return false for now. I'm going to come back to this and of course implement this method, but basically this is going to allow us to then say something like fv.hasErrors to know if this, if this object or if this, form has any errors. So this is mainly used when trying to submit the form. Obviously, we're going to have to cancel the submission if the form has errors. So that's what that is going to be used for, a simple getter right there. Another method here is going to be called register. And this one here is the main one. So register is going to allow you to register a new form validation rule. So here we're going to say selector. Now this selector is actually going to be the selector for the input field itself. All right, so that's that one. We can also pass through here something called check. So check is going to be the function which you define to check whether or not a particular input field is valid. So basically, it's going to give you a success or a fail in terms of, if there's something wrong with it. Okay, so more on that very shortly, but for now, we've defined our constructor, this getter, and this method right here. So now we can head back inside the main.js and we can start to take a look at some of the usage for this form validator. So let's say I want to do something like, okay, I've got this username right here. Let's keep it simple. So let's just say here, look, if your username is more than 5 characters, then we cannot, submit the form. And by the way, I should have mentioned this at the start of today's video, but make sure you do all of your actual validation on the server side. So it's cool to have front-end validation, makes it quick and responsive, etc. But you definitely want to make sure that you do not use front-end validation as your only source of validation, because of course someone can easily go in the browser dev tools and submit the form manually, whatever it might be. So make sure you got server-side validation. But anyway, let's say as an example here, I want to limit your username to be no more than 5 characters long. Okay, so let's go inside the main.js here, and we're going to say right here, I'm going to say fv.register. So we're going to register right here. We're going to say, look, let's get the username input field. So it's got an ID of username just like that. Okay, as we can see right here, we're going to say, okay, cool, username. Then we're going to say here the check function. So this right here, right, it's going to provide you with the current value and a reference to the input field for convenience. So we'll say here input field. Okay. Now, when I say that this function is going to provide you with this data right here, we're going to be the ones that are going to fire off this function and provide that data inside this method here, register. So I'll come back to that later on, but for now, back to the usage. So we're saying here, look, okay, if the value of the username, okay, is more than 5 characters in length, so I've got to say here, value.length is more than 5. If it's more than 5, then we're going to return here, and we're going to say pass is false, okay? Then we'll say error is username must be no more than 5 characters. Okay, so this return is going to be passed into our register, and then we can use this data to then display a message, and the message is going to be this one right here. Okay, cool. Now, we're now going to say return, if this condition did not pass, so if the value length is less than or equal to 5, then we can say pass is true and no error message. So this right here is the usage of the form validator. Okay, that's all it is. Now, let's head back inside the actual class here and start to implement some of these methods and the constructor and so on. So to finish off the constructor, because we're going to deal with the register method last, so the constructor is also going to contain a JavaScript set. Okay, so a set is simply just, it's very similar to an array, but it contains only unique values. If you try to put the same value in a set twice, it's not going to work. So we'll say here, this dot inputs with errors is equal to a new set. Now, look, this name is a bit questionable, okay? But basically, this set is going to be a list of every single input field which currently has errors, okay? So, of course, if the length of this set is more than 0, so if there's at least one input field in this set, then we have errors. Therefore, in this getter, we can say return this dot inputs with errors is greater than 0. In fact, dot size is greater than 0, okay? That one is now completed. We can now say, look, okay, cool. This .form.addEvent listener, okay, gonna listen for the submit event. So when the form gets submitted, okay, or when the user attempts to submit the form, we're gonna grab onto the event object right here, and we're gonna immediately say, look, let's stop the form from submitting. We can do this by saying e.prevent default. So now we've essentially disabled the submit button, okay? But now we're going to say, look, okay, cool. If we don't have any errors, so this dot has errors or this not has errors, okay? If there are no errors, we can say this dot form dot submit, okay? So calling the submit method through JavaScript is not going to trigger this event listener. So basically the form is going to submit perfectly fine. Now with this right here, we're basically okay. So if I was to save this and go back in the browser and submit the form, it goes through perfectly fine. If I was to hard code this has errors to be true, let's test this out, right? Press save, go back in the browser, and we can no longer submit the form. So we know that this logic here is definitely working, okay? So the fun part for today's video, the register method. So for this one, the first thing to do, once you say, look, let's register a new validation rule against this input field with this rule here. We're gonna say, look, const input field is equal to this.form.query selector, and then we can pass through here the selector. Now, why did I say form.query selector and not just document.query selector? That is because you want to sort of restrict any selectors to be only part of the form that you submit. So let's just say you pass in a class of username, but there are multiple username classes on the web page. You only want the username class of this sign-up form to be the one that gets, set the validation for. So that's why I'm basically scoping this to only part of the form. We're now going to say const error element is equal to input field dot closest. I'm going to say here the closest dot input, then say query selector, then say input __ error. So right here, we're basically starting at the input field and we're saying, let's go up to the closest input container. So starting at this username, go up to input container, then say query selector and get me the input error class, this one right here. So you can obviously just say something like next element sibling instead. So form field dot next element sibling. But this right here is a bit safer because if you were to move around the input error or move it up here or something, that code's going to break if you don't use query selector. So that's why I prefer to use that. So now we basically have got a reference to the input field and the error element. Okay. So now we can say const execute is equal to a new function. So this execute function is going to execute the test. So is this form field valid? Okay. It's going to do this by saying something like const. Okay. We can say here, pass and error inside these curly braces. We can say equal to check and then pass in here the input field and, that's actually it. My mistake, guys, sorry. It's the input field dot value, okay, and the input field. So you can, of course, just skip passing through the value and get it directly from the input field itself, but this is a little bit easier to work with, especially when you start defining those rules. So anyway, we can see here we're simply using object destructuring here to grab the return object from the check function, which you provide, and then populate pass and error with those two individual properties. So now we can say something like console.log will log out if it's passed or not, and the error itself, if there's an error, okay? Now we can say, okay, cool. Input field.add event listener. When the value changes, we're gonna simply call the execute function just like that, okay? I'll save this, go back in the browser here. I'm now going to say something like dcode as my username. I can trigger the change event right here by getting out of it. And we get true, it is passed validation and there are no errors, it's undefined. If I was to make this 6 characters long, dcode 5, get out of it, we get false and it says username must be no more than 5 characters. So that's working perfectly fine. But we do want to make sure that we actually validate on page load. So we'll say here, execute just like that when you first register a input field. So now if I go back inside here, of course it's fine, but we can see the validation has been executed. It's true because it's no more than 5 characters, but I do want to say, look, let's make sure that you actually have a value in the first place. So we'll say here, if value.length is equal to 0 or it's more than 5, we must say something like username must be between let's say 1 and 5 characters, something like that, right? Save this back in the browser and we get that error immediately on page load. Enter a character and it goes away. Cool. Now, back inside here, we can now start to actually display some of this stuff and essentially, add some data to the set. So back inside here, we're going to say, okay, error element.text content is going to be equal to here error or empty string. So if you were to provide an error to this, function here, it's going to use it. Otherwise, it'll default to an empty string for your passes, basically. So back in the browser, we get the error displaying right there. The problem is this displays on page load before the user gets a chance to even, enter some information. So to sort of fix that, you can either prevent this from executing on page load, it's up to you, or if you need to have it execute on page load for whatever reason, we can simply go inside here and we can say hide errors, okay, as a second or as a argument to this function. We can say if we are not hiding errors, then we're going to populate that error in the error element. Then on page load, we're going to pass through true here, okay? Now, of course, if you execute normally, it's going to be false or undefined, but it won't be true, so this is going to run. Save this back in the browser, and now it's gone. If I enter, let's just do dcode 8, 6 characters, it gets displayed again. So that's that one. The last bit here is going to be really simple. We're going to say, look, if we did not pass the validation check, then we can say this.inputs with errors.add, and we can add the input field to the list of input fields that have errors. Otherwise, if it did pass, we're all good. We can simply remove that input field from the set. So we're going to say here, my mistake, .delete. So we'll say here .delete if it's perfectly fine. And obviously then, assuming you have no other input fields in your set, you should be able to submit the form. And that's basically it for the form validator. Back in the browser here, we can do something like, let's try and sign up. We get nothing because, of course, we have an error because obviously this did run, but there was no error message being displayed. And we can say something like, yep, let's just do dcode 8, sign up, and we can't do it. Now, on that before, where it's sort of, on page load, if you do want to sort of, display an error message when they press sign up, you can simply say, look, let's loop through all of my input fields with errors when you submit the form and just display those messages if you want to, but I'll keep it simple here. Now, we can see if I also say decode and sign up, it is going to be submitted perfectly fine, and that's basically it. So that's the main chunk for today's video, but I do want to show you a couple of examples of how you can actually simplify the process inside this file right here. So if you want to create rules which are going to be used on multiple input fields, you can do that pretty easily. So here we'll say something like function, okay? And we'll say, let's just do validate length, okay? As an example, it'll take in a value and the input field itself, just like it did down here. Then we can simply just copy all of this code and put it inside this function. Then we can say, okay, no worries. Let's say for the username, let's validate the length. That's basically it. We can do the exact same thing for something like a password or whatever it might be, and it's gonna work totally fine. So you can reuse your rules right there by simply storing those functions up here and then referencing them down here. All right, that is all for today's video, guys. Hope you enjoyed that one. If you did, drop a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.